Hello and welcome to our video on Wilfred Owen's exposure. Now Wilfred Owen, from what we know about him, we know that he fought in World War One. He was a protest poet, which means he was against issues and he fought quite strongly about those issues. He challenged the way that war was presented to people at home, and we're going to explain a bit more about that in a bit. And he actually received injuries from war, and as a result of that he suffered from shell shock, PTSD, which we know as nowadays. So he was emotionally and psychologically affected by war himself. He then returned to the war after receiving treatment for shell shock, and sadly he died an hour before the war ended, and his mother was notified of his death actually when the bells were ringing out to celebrate the end of the war, quite tragically and sadly. Now before we look at Wilfred Owen in a little bit more detail, we need to look at some of the other poets that were going on at the time that he was writing poetry. Now on the left hand side we've got one poem by a poet called Jesse Pope. And if you have a look at the poem and pause it and read the full poem itself, you'll see that it's quite an unusual poem because it's from a woman who is persuading men to go to war. So it's very, very pro-war, a bit of propaganda. And if you can see that we've got that little feather on the left-hand side there on the picture. The reason why there is the feather is that we do know that some people accused men of being cowards if they didn't sign up and fight to join the war. And to show that they were cowardice, people would give them out feathers. And Jessie Pope was one of those kind of people who she wanted people to fight, and she thought that men were bad if they didn't fight. And so you can see they've got a very, very quite clearly pro-war poem. So on one hand you've got that trying to force people to go to war. And then you've got other poets. Now, Siegfried Sassoon was actually a mentor for Wilfred Owen. So he kind of like a teacher helping with writing his poetry. And he wrote from a different angle. He wrote about the realism, about what war was realistically about. And so Wilfred Owen has got these two kind of different styles of poetry that were going on at the time. Now, when we look at these two different types of poem, you've got this very much stoic, which is kind of being brave, accepting things as they are, going into battle and fighting. And the phrase that we call the British stiff upper lip is you don't show emotions, you may be scared, but you're going to do it. You're doing it for your country. And then on the other side, we've got the emotional, the opposition. You know, you shouldn't be fighting. This isn't a great thing. And Wilfred Owen is one of those poets that kind of sort of skates around these things. And he wasn't quite incredibly emotional and opposite, but he wasn't propaganda. And so Wilfred Owen kind of fits somewhere in between these two different types of poet. Now, before we actually look at the poem, now the poem is called Exposure. Now, exposure is an interesting word because exposure means a lot of different things. So it's a noun. And the first thing it means is it's the state of having no protection from something harmful. So we know that people who've been left out in mountains, they could get injured from exposure. And that means they've been exposed to the weather and the cold temperatures. So this could be a poem that's linking into that. Or it could be revealing something secret, possibly damaging or embarrassing. Now, going back to what we said about the war poets and their attitude towards war, is this poem exposing something embarrassing or damaging about war itself? Or the term could be used to describe when the piece of film has been chemically changed. So what happens is when a piece of film has been exposed to light, you can't use it again. So the whole thing about being exposed to something is it somehow changes you. So is this poem about how war changes you, and that once you've been in war, you're never the same? Now, we know from Wilfred Owen, he suffered from shell shock, so he was affected by war. So as we go through the poem, I want to keep thinking back to this title and how does it link in and what is it really saying about the poem. Now, before we look at the poem, we're going to pause it and just have a think about the big ideas. Now, remember, when we're writing about poetry, we need to start with the ideas. And that's where people make a mistake with poetry. What they tend to do with poetry is they try to find the techniques. And really, you need to start with the ideas. Start with the ideas first and then talk about the techniques. Anybody can spot a simile, but really it's the intelligent, bright students who'll be able to tell us the ideas that are in the poem. And anybody can do that, really. So you've just got to move away from spotting techniques. So what I'd like to do for me in a second is pause the video when I tell you to, and I want you to just think about these ideas. What is it like to really fight in war? Is it really fitting and noble to die for one's country? Is it a great thing to die for your country? And what is the relationship between religion and war? Something Miss Bailey would be quite happy that we're talking about here. And remember, with RE, you can bring stuff into English. You know, because you're doing stuff in RE, it doesn't stay in RE, you can bring it into English, and it actually helps and develops your level of understanding when it comes to the poems itself. So just pause the video. When the pause symbol disappears, that's when we're going to carry on with things. Okay, so what's it like to fight in war? So we're going to have a look at the poem now. I'm going to read it to you. And I want to keep these ideas in your head and whatever ideas you've got. Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the assailant. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more, in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden, successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them, wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with a lingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed with crusted, dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed, and on us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile, true on child, or field, or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight, his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads, crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in their shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Now let's go back to those ideas in the poem. What is it really like to fight in war? Well, if we have a look at this poem, it's not a very pleasant experience, but not in the way that most people would expect a war would be unpleasant. In this poem, it's very slow and nothing happens. The weather is horrible, it's cold, it's wet, everything seems grey and unpleasant, and nothing's happening. Now, this contrasts with how we usually see war, because we expect war to be lots of fighting and being aggressive. But these soldiers are waiting, and they're waiting for something to happen, and they don't know when it's going to happen. Now, is it fitting and noble to die for one's country? Now, if we look at the poem, is it an honourable experience that they've got? Is it great, the experience that they've got? In a way, it seems like war is torture, that these soldiers want to fight and probably happy to die to end their misery. But what they're experiencing is this torture. And it's one of the things about war is that, we expect war to be happening quick, but actually there's a lot of waiting. And if we see that in the poem, there is quite a lot of time waiting around. And we know from World War One that, people were waiting around and you had shifts, and sometimes there would be action, sometimes there wouldn't be action. And here we've got soldiers waiting around. We don't have any of that action, fighting, killing. We just have people waiting. And then what's the relationship between religion and war? Now, the interesting thing about this poem is that Wilfred Owen was originally very, very religious. And he was a priest's assistant at one stage, but he gave up the position because he was told he'd have to give up poetry because it wasn't seen as being very, very Christian. So he left and still carried on those views. And people still think he's very, very Christian. But what we do know is that war made him question his faith. And in the poem, we can see that. We can see elements, and it talks about God, and this idea is there. So there was a general feeling that the war had transformed from being something that was about very, very Christian and about really being about defense and liberation, and moving to about aggression and conquest. And that is the problem with wars. The fine line between aggression and conquest and liberation and freedom and doing what's right. And Wilfred Owen had that question over the war and in the war. Now, when we're looking at the poetry, you need to start with your ideas. So what's your ideas? Now, the great thing about poetry is there's hundreds and hundreds of ideas, but you've got to do that thinking for them. Here are 3 ideas that we could talk about in the poem. Wilfred Owen presents the emotional suffering of war. So what does it feel like to be in a war emotionally? He also presents the reality of conflict. Most people, when they think about war, they think about guns, fighting, action, explosion sort of thing. This poem contradicts that, doesn't it? It shows us that it isn't about all that. And it's about a lot of waiting and dealing with unpleasant conditions. Wilfred also presents how powerless man is. So the environment, the nature is all powerful, the weather is attacking them, but man is on his own, isolated. So always start when looking at poems from an idea. So what ideas could we have about the poem? What is the poem saying? And this can be kind of like the key message or the key idea that's going on. Now note we haven't talked about how the poem's written at all yet, and we're going to go through that in stages. So the thing about the poem, and we're going to start off by talking about images. Now images are the easiest thing to talk about in a poem because they're the things that jump out straight away. And the key thing about this is the poem is set in no man's land. And what's no man's land? Well, no man's land is the land between 2 sides fighting. It's the bit in the middle. So on one side, you've got one group of people, and the other side you've got another group of people. And actually it's a place of nowhere. And we know in World War One that this place was barren, it was awful, full of unexploded bombs, and there would be bodies if some soldiers hadn't collected them, and you would have a ceasefire where soldiers would collect the bodies at the end of the day at certain points. So people would be clearing some stuff, but you'd have to wait. And so if you're injured in no man's land, you would have to wait till somebody rescued you, or you would die there. And that's what happened. So the image that we've got in the poem of no man's land is really a metaphor for what Wilfred Owen is saying about the soldiers, is that a soldier is really in the middle of life and death. They're in this place where they're neither dead nor alive, and they're in the middle of somewhere. And so they're stuck in this place. And so it's not a nice place, it's a horrible place. And so really what Wilfred Owen is trying to show us is how unpleasant it is to be a soldier fighting a war, and how it is you're not quite alive, but you're not quite dead, and you're somewhere in the middle. Now, we know that from RE about purgatory, and we know about purgatory being a state in which when we die, our souls can either go to heaven or hell, or they can go to purgatory, which is a state in which you have to earn off your sins, so you don't quite go into heaven. Okay, so what we kind of have in the poem, if we're going to take this idea that Wilfred Owen was quite religious, we've got this idea of actually being in some kind of purgatory, that these soldiers have to work off their sins and they're waiting to go to heaven. So it's almost like they're dead, but they're waiting for one last thing, for them to go to heaven. And so we've got this idea of deeply religious when we think about it in there. So we've got this metaphor. Okay, so the whole poem is set in no man's land. So we've got that metaphor there. We might come back to this as we go through and looking through that. Now, also when we're looking at the poem, and this is where poetry is quite easy because you can pick out the images. So we've got some images in the poem. So we've got wire and we've got the snowflakes. Now we're going to look at two things in particular. So if we look at the barbed wire. Now when you think about it, what is the general effect of having barbed wire? Well, the effect is it's something negative, isn't it? It's something horrible, it's something painful, it's something hurtful. So as readers, we get a sense of pain, don't we? That's what we're supposed to feel when we see the wire. But also, I don't know if you've been familiar with barbed wire, but barbed wire is really, really horrible. When you're trapped in it, it's really, really hard to escape. Now, if we look at that image as being a symbol, that symbol of how these soldiers are trapped there, they can't escape, and how painful it is, and if we think about it, barbed wire isn't going to kill you, but what it will do is it will scratch you, and it will give you small little bits of pain. And so what we've got in the poem is this idea of being hurt and regularly hurt, but not a big pain. And again, what I've said, that idea that this is about the torture of war, of what soldiers go through. Now we can also take that barbed wire and look at that wire and look at it, go back to Wilfred Owen, what we know about him being very, very Christian, because what does barbed wire look like? It looks like the crown of thorns that Christ had on his head, and that idea of pain and suffering, and this idea, and if we take it further, we can link it into obviously the crucifixion, and this idea that the soldiers go through all this suffering and all this pain so that the people at home can live, which is exactly what happened with Christ. Christ died for our sins. So we see this imagery of what soldiers do and the pain and the agony that we've got there. So quite a big, powerful image that we've got there. Now the other image we've got there is the snowflake. Now let's think about snowflakes. Snowflakes are usually very, very positive images, aren't they? So, when we think of snow, we think of nice things. But if we look at the image in a bit more detail, well, snowflakes are unique, they're individual, but also snowflakes disappear quite quickly. So is the poem and the snow and the snowflakes, could that also be a metaphor? A metaphor for soldiers and how short life is, and how these soldiers, there are so many of them, and how quickly they die. We know that World War One, lots of soldiers died very quickly, and the amount of them. And if we think about it in terms of snowflakes, we get hundreds of snowflakes, but they quickly disappear. And it's the speed of that. So you can see very easily, you can pick out two images and explain them very, very easily in detail. Now, the other thing we can do then, now that we've got this idea about the poem, talking about what it's like to be in war and what the reality of war is and how terrible and the suffering and how helpless they feel, we can start looking at some of the word choices and some of the language choices. Now, you can see I've got a pause symbol there. What I'd like you to do for me is pause this video and have a look and see what can you say about each of these different pieces that I've highlighted in these 4 different quotes. So what do they teach us? What do we understand? What can we get out of this? And think about what kind of technique that's used in there. So just pause the video, and when the pause symbol disappears, that's the point for you to start listening to the video. Okay, so let's just have a look at these things then. Now, one of the mistakes that students make with poetry is they tend to just look at the technique straight away. And what we want to do is we want to link these ideas, and we want to link it to the effect on the reader, but also what the writer's saying about things. So if we look at this one here, so the merciless iced winds knife us. Now, the key thing there is obviously knife, and what we've got there is obviously personification. So a bit of personification because the winds knife us. Now, is that a positive or negative technique that we've got there? The effect of it? Well, it's negative, isn't it? And the soldiers, what we've got here, merciless. Now, to show mercy is to show compassion. So the wind doesn't show any compassion, and the wind is knifing us. So what the soldiers are experiencing is a terrible experience, and it's almost like the world is against them, nature is against them, and so it's not just other soldiers that are fighting them, but the weather is fighting them. So it makes us think, well, who's supporting these soldiers? Is there anybody supporting these soldiers? Now, we know Jesse Pope, and we talked about before about people at home trying to get people to go to war, and they were supporting him. But does he feel that support there? No. And basically it's him on his own against it. And the fact that they knife us, the fact that they're knifing them and using language associated with violence and war, makes us think that actually, who is the enemy? Is it other humans, or is it nature in the poem? Then if we have a look at the second one here, so the clouds sag, stormy. We all know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds stormy. Now, interesting here, we've got the pronoun we. We know, as interesting as a pronoun, gives that idea that we're kind of like, we're part of this together. So we're kind of, in a way, the poet's trying to include us a bit into this poem, so we feel what they're feeling at the moment. So we know that they feel like things are attacking with the personification of the weather, but kind of also got here, only war knows lasts, rain soaks, clouds sag, stormy. Now, in a way, we've got a list here, lasts, rain soaks, and clouds stormy. All right, but we've also got this verb here, sag. The clouds sag. Now, again, we've kind of got that personification, but we've also got this idea of, I could say, about pathetic fallacy, that the weather is reflecting how the soldiers are. And we know what weather's like. We know it can change from one weather to another within hours and within days. So here we've got, the weather attacking, but the clouds are sagging. So almost like the soldiers, and sagging, they're not standing up straight, they're drooping and falling down. That lack of energy. It's almost like, people have given up. So the weather is given up as well as the soldiers. So look at this one here then. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew, we watch them wandering up and down. The wind's nonchalance. Now again, we've got lots of sound effects here. We've got flow, flakes, flock. And then we've got the repetition of the W sound. And not just at the start of words, but within words. And what we've got is a lot of sound effects. Now, don't neglect and forget about sound effects when looking at poems, because there's an effect there. Now, the flowing flakes flock. Now, think about it. Is it a positive or a negative effect? I want to keep going back to that idea. Is it a positive or a negative effect? With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. So we could say it's quite a positive experience. And it's kind of a gentle sound, isn't it? Flowing flakes flock. And if we look at the we watch, wandering, winds, we could say it's quite a gentle thing. And maybe, if we want to think about it, it could suggest maybe that with it being so gentle, the kind of the slow, methodical pace, and how, there's no rush about things and everything's waiting about time and things happening. So we've got that sound effect there. And the last one, if we have a look, slowly our ghosts drag home. Now, we've got a metaphor. Now, it's interesting, in this poem, uses the word ghost. Now, positive or negative image? It's a negative image, because it gives us that sense of death, doesn't it? And that sense of the past and something that's no longer human. So if we look at the poem and think about this idea about ghosts, and thinking back to what we said about this life and death, well, could be that the soldiers don't feel human anymore. They've lost that human aspect, and that they're almost dead. And this links back to that purgatory comment, didn't we? About the whole idea that these soldiers are probably, waiting to die, and they want to die. And this is just reinforcing that point, that they're like ghosts. They're not real people anymore. They're no longer themselves. Which is quite sad when you think about it, because, they don't feel human anymore. They've stopped feeling human, and referring to themselves as ghosts shows that they don't feel alive anymore. And this adds to that whole thing about the poem, and that sadness of how he feels like this is torture, that they've lost their ability to live and lost their ability to see life as it is. Now, other things that you can talk about the poems on an AO2 focus is the form of the poem. The form of the poem is just, why use this type of poem? What is it about this poem? And if we have a look at the poem itself and the verses that we've got here, each stanza follows a very clear structure. It follows this 4 lines, and then we have this short little question or a statement. And that kind of reflects the kind of journey that these soldiers have probably got, because what they're probably doing is they're getting on with their jobs, their lives as a soldier, and then every so often what they do is they just stop and think, and they ask those questions. And then if we go on to the next poem, We have these 4 lines of carrying on their work, and then they have that one question or that one point. So if we have a look at the lines and how the lines are worked out, it's almost like they're doing so much that they don't have that much time to think about things. And it's only every so often that they think about things, and it's right at the end there. Now also in the poem we've got half rhyme. So a half rhyme really is not a full rhyme, like cat and bat. So we've got wire and wall, and we've got is that opening sound, which is half rhyme. Now it's not a full rhyme, okay, and the problem is this idea of the unsettledness and uncertain nature, and we can say that's reflected in the half rhyme pattern of the poem, in that it's about that unsettled nature. Nothing is quite as it is. We don't know what's happening, we don't know when it's going to happen, so it's that unsettled nature that's in the poem. We've also got that structure A, B, B, A, and that kind of sort of, soldiers are doing their job day by day, and their job will be very, very structured. So we see that in the structure of the poem and the way that things are rhyming and half rhymes that we've got there as well. Right, now we're going to look at the structure. Now, again, this is another thing that you can look at when looking at the poems, and we're going to do this with all the poems. We're going to look at it through these different things, not because that's the way you should do it, but it just gives you more things to talk about and realize that there are different things you can talk about. Otherwise, what happens with poetry is people just spot every simile and try to explain every simile in there, and you don't. And what you need to do is talk about one or two, but be able to talk about in real great depth. So if we look at the structure of the poem, the majority of the poem is just explaining the experience. And the first few stanzas is all about that experience. It begins with our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. But then there's a change in the poem, because the poem changes at the third stanza from the last one. Slowly our ghosts drag home. And what we see in this poem is a turning point. We call it a volta in poetry. So that's a turning point, a volta. And what you do is you have a change. And in this poem, this is the key change. Because what we see now at this is, what is it like when the soldiers go home? Because this isn't just a poem that's all about being in the battlefield. This is what it's like when the soldiers get home. And what do they find when they get home? The shutters and doors are all closed. The doors are closed to us. We turn back to our dying. So in a way, there's a real sadness, because we think in war that what happens is, the people love them at home. This is the turning point in that poem, because actually they don't love him. And also that maybe these soldiers have somehow changed. They describe themselves as ghosts, but yet the houses are closed off to them. So, and we know war changes, and shell shock, PTSD, we know that changes people. But this is other people's attitude towards the soldiers as well. Now, if we look at the next stanza, and then we start seeing this idea about God, and we know about how religious Wilfred Owen was, but this idea about how for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid, therefore not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. And that little phrase there, for love of God seems dying, their love of God possibly dying because of what's happening, and you would, in this circumstance, be asking those questions, and we're seeing that from these soldiers asking those questions about religion and about faith and purpose. They're in a situation where it's not ending, it's torture, and they think that they're doing it for good, but then they're asking those questions. And then the last stanza. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in their shaking grasp, and pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Now we go back in the last stanza, and we go back to the battlefield. So these two stanzas here, are quite interesting because they do change the overall structure of the poem, because they're not on the battlefield. This is home and these are thoughts, and this little bit here are the thoughts from the voice in the poem. And then this last bit goes back to the battlefield. And in a way, nothing's changed, because we go back to the battlefield and there isn't anything happening. And it's the same thing. And the fact that we get this line here, but nothing happens. Still nothing's happened. They go home. People don't like them. They come back and nothing happens. And then we've got this repetition of ice. And in a way, what we've got in the poem is kind of things come full circle. And actually for the soldiers, that this is a cycle of misery. And these soldiers are going round and round and round and round of the same experiences, and nothing is changing for them. And the sad thing is that this burying party, obviously soldiers that are picking up other soldiers, but they don't know people properly, over half-known faces. And so these soldiers are picking up the dead bodies and taking them away of people they don't know. And that makes this even sadder in the poem, is that in a way that these soldiers are unloved. And that's really, really a sad thing in the poem, is that these soldiers are unloved and undervalued and not cared for. So if we look at that, the Volta, the turning point in the poem, and how these three last stanzas are quite a change in how the rest of the poem is written. Now, once you've talked about your ideas, you've spotted techniques, then you really need to be thinking about what the poet is teaching us. Now, this is the really, really important thing, because this steps up your ideas. Now, the key words you need to be including in your writing, not all of them, but using one or two of them, is this: teaches, criticizes, attacks, advocates, celebrates, warns, and exposes. Because at the end of the day, we want to know what ideas the poet's got, we want to know what techniques the poet's used, but also we want to think about what is the message. What is the poet trying to do? So he's trying to teach us something, not just make us feel something, but teach us something, or make us understand something. So what is the bigger message here in the poem? So he could be teaching us how unpredictable war is. He could be attacking the common view of war. Poets like Jesse Pope thought war was great and everybody should be fighting. It's the great thing, and if you die, it'll be a noble thing. But actually, what we see in the poem and what Owen exposes is the reality of war. This is what war was like for people. He warns us of the conditions of war. He's showing us this is how bad it is and how unpleasant. And you think war is fighting, it isn't. It's waiting, it's picking up dead bodies, it's dealing with the cold, the mud, the misery. Also, it teaches us how isolated the soldiers are. A common idea that we have is soldiers are in a gang and they're fighting together and they feel part of a community. These soldiers feel left out, neglected, isolated, separated from each other, separated from the war, separated from their family at home, separated at home, and separated from life. It's also attacking the idea that these soldiers are waiting for death. They're fighting and they know they're going to die. It also exposes how weak man is. And the whole thing about soldiers and fighting is we have this idea that they're brave, strong people. But here in the poem, we see how weak and how awful things are for them. Now, this is an interesting one. And again, bring in RE. This could be looking at how about religion. Is it attacking? Is this poem attacking religion? And is it criticizing how we use religion to say why we're fighting, but actually it isn't to do with religion, and actually religion is separate from this? Or, and like we mentioned with the wire and the thorn of crowns, is this what soldiers are? They're like a Christ-like figure. They're dying for us, for our sins, so we may live full lives. Now, once you've got that, so you've got your idea, you've spotted a technique, and then you talk about what the poet is teaching us, we then can expand on points. So think about, where else do we see this in the poem? Why does the poet have this stance? So why do we think Owen is attacking religion? Is it because he's become disillusioned with religion because he's seen so many people die? And the key thing here is also, what is the poet trying to do? Yes, he may be teaching us about the conditions. Then what is he trying to do? Is he trying to stop us from going to war? Is he trying to stop the war? And that's a really, really important thing to think about, because then that shows that understanding what's going on under the surface. And also understand what's going on at the time. You know, if we're talking about this idea about the conditions of the war, we know that in the war, people are persuaded to go into war, to fight on the line. And this is actually Wilfred Owen kind of attacking that and kind of showing people what it is and what it's like in there. Now, the more poems you see from the anthology that we're going to be studying, the more you'll be able to make connections. Now, in this poem, and there are other poems that you're going to see, but you're going to be able to make connections between other poems. Now, this poem has got nature, and we can see the power of nature. Nature is more powerful than man in this, and we can see how powerless is of man. We could also connect this with other poems because of honour. You know, this poem isn't about an honourable death. This is about not necessarily dishonour, but it's challenging the notion that it's a brave thing to die for your country. And it's challenging that idea, that propaganda. And actually, it's showing us that actually soldiers go through torture and a horrible experience. Now, the poem we can link to other poems because this is the conflict between thoughts and feelings. You know, we've got this idea of a soldier who wants to fight but is conflicted because nothing's happening, who's feeling religious but yet questioning what they're doing. We've also got this poem because it's about the conflict between life and death, that these soldiers are metaphorically almost dead when they're waiting to die, but they're trying to save those who are alive. And we've got the conflict between nature and man. Now, the more poems you get and you go through, the more you'll understand that there are connections between these poems, and you can see those connections as you go along. But do revisit this video and keep coming back to this so you can help yourself with the poem. Now, with each of the poems, we're going to have a set of questions, and what I'd like to do is just quickly see if you can answer these questions. Again, we've got the pause symbol on the video so that you can pause the video at this point now. I'm now going to take away the pause symbol and start going through the answers. Okay, number one, what's the poet's connection to war? Well, we know that he fought in war and he was a protest poet. What animals celebrate when the soldiers head back to war? The mice. What's the weather like in the poem? Well, we know it's cold, we know it's windy, we know it's icy, and we also know there's snow as well. What N is repeated in the poem several times? Nothing. What G is used to describe the soldiers, ghosts. What I is in their eyes at the end, that's ice. What punctuation mark did the writer use to make things seem very slow? Well, in the first stanza we've got ellipsis, and throughout the rest of the poem we've got lots of commas. What kind of sentence does the writer use to create a sense of never-ending torture? We've got long, multiple clause sentences. What pronoun does the writer use to show that the speaker isn't alone? We've got two pronouns. We've got we and are. Now, the reason why we've got those questions, and we want you to memorize those questions, is because those are key questions. Now, when it comes to the actual GCSE exam, you will have to know one poem off by heart when you're writing your essay, because the assessment will give you a printed poem and you'll have to use your memory. And we've got these questions to help people memorize bits of the poem. The first three questions, the red ones, are just the basics of the poem. The next four are quotes. You can use quotes in your writing. And the next three, the green ones, are about techniques and effects, because that's what you're going to have to talk about explaining things. So, and that's it for the video. So, what we have done is just gone through a quick little overview of the poem. There is so much more of these poems, and the more you read the poem and the more you research them, the more you find out and new different things. Now, on the video, this isn't the definitive things, so there's lots of other things and techniques in the poems that we could have mentioned. However, that's the beauty of poetry, that you don't have to talk about everything and you can find new things and new ideas. We do suggest that you annotate the poems and that you go through the poems and you research and read around the poems and see what you can find, what other people have said and other ideas. Thank you.